Good afternoon, everybody. This is panel number 1, and I'm David Strauss, and I'm pleased to introduce you to our 3 panelists. The title of the panel, provocatively enough, is When Research Offends. Speaking with us today, and I'll just introduce them briefly and refer you to the conference materials for additional information. First, we're going to hear from Walter Bakhtin, who's a professor of medical psychology and psychiatry and nursing at Columbia and co-director of the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Health Initiative at the New York State Psychiatric Institute in conjunction with Columbia and the School of Nursing. Next, we'll hear from Susan Brown Trinidad, who's a research scientist in the Department of Bioethics and Humanities at the University of Washington. Her academic interests have largely focused on the ethical, social, and legal implications of genomic research. And last, we'll hear from Carl Hart, who's an associate professor in the departments of psychology and psychiatry at Columbia and a research scientist in the Division on Substance Abuse at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. I'll add briefly that Carl is also the author of a book which is for sale, and he's available for signing the book after this talk, and it's called High Price: A Neuroscientist's Journey of Self-Discovery That Challenges Everything You Know About Drugs and Society. So I just wanted to begin with a little story that in a way reflects some of the experiences that I've had in the past as an IRB chair related to the issues that we're going to discuss today. And I recall that I was at a Christmas party at a neighbor's apartment just a few years ago, and a young woman, an African-American woman who was an attorney, asked me where I worked, and I told her, and she replied, "Isn't that where there was racist research on children of color?" She was referring to a study that occurred well over a decade earlier that had sought to examine the biological link between brain serotonin systems and aggressive behavior in youth. The study recruited the brothers of boys who were imprisoned and collected behavioral and biological data. The boys in the study were representative of the population of juveniles in the prison in New York City at the time, and while it was not the intention of the study team, the subjects were exclusively Black or Latino. The study was experienced by the community as asking the question, is violence biologically determined? Are Black and Latino boys from New York City aggressive by nature? We, the institution, were seen as exposing children of color to risk to answer a question that was fundamentally a racist one. There were protests, daily cover stories in the New York Post, ultimately a visit by OHRP, formerly known as OPRR, and finally, congressional hearings and a lawsuit. Certainly, we as an institution and the investigators involved learned many important lessons from this particular experience. Today's panel seeks to address the broader questions of research and community harm. Are there questions which by their very nature cause harm, add stigma to already burdened or marginalized communities or populations? And then what are the harms associated with not asking such questions? How should an IRB and institution look at subject selection during review to ensure fairness and to optimize knowledge? And how can institutions and investigators engage communities in making these decisions? Our goal today is to provide both a theoretical and pragmatic approach to some of these questions. So let me welcome Walter to the podium to begin.
Thank you very much, David. Yes, my task is to tell you a little bit about whether research has offended and how research might be considered offensive in the area of LGBT health research. And I think what we can say is that certainly classification as a mental disorder way back was offensive. I think that research actually helped us with that and remove the diagnosis, helped to remove the diagnosis from the DSM. But I think since then, I think generally research in the area of LGBT health has really been neglected. I had the opportunity to be part of the Institute of Medicine committee that reviewed the research and recommended the research agenda to NIH. We were supposed to identify the research gaps, but we really found more gap than research. And I think that is somehow, in certain areas, related, I think, to the controversy that, for example, came about around the classification of homosexuality as a mental disorder. Let me advance. Okay. So I think most of you will know, but I'll just explain. Lesbian, gay, bisexual is a matter of sexual orientation, attractions towards men, women, or both. And transgender people are a group whose gender identity differs significantly from the sex assigned at birth. And many transgender people will live in a gender role that is different from the one they were assigned at birth. This population is a minority population, and as such can be considered a vulnerable population because the stigma that is attached to their minority status has been shown to be associated with health discrepancies. However, the LGBT population has not been recognized yet as an official health disparity population, certainly not by NIH. So I want to give you 3 examples of ethical issues that have come up where it's really important to ask that question. How can we ask this research question? If so, how should it be framed, and what do we need to think about as we pursue these questions? And the first example is in the area of early intervention, early medical intervention, as well as early psychotherapeutic intervention for gender nonconforming children and adolescents. So in the case of homosexuality, there was in the past controversy about reparative therapy, psychotherapy, and other modalities approaches to attempt to change one's sexual orientation. And research actually turned out that in the long run, that approach was not effective, and today it's considered unethical to conduct that approach when it comes to homosexuality. However, in the case of gender nonconforming children, it's a little bit different, because one of the questions there is, when a child is gender nonconforming, in most cases, this child will grow up to be gay or bisexual, in some cases heterosexual, and in other cases, in very few cases, actually transgender. And as treatment approaches for gender nonconforming children, particularly the medical intervention of suppressing puberty in early adolescence, become more available, the question is, how do we distinguish children who will grow up to be gay and who may not require those medical interventions from other children who are more likely to grow up transgender and may then experience a conflict with their body and may benefit from puberty-suppressing hormones to help that body from a very early age on align with their gender identity. And so one of the questions is, what characterizes persistence of gender nonconformity to the degree of identifying with the other gender versus desistance of that orientation? And people have made the argument that even the use of those words, persistence versus desistance, is offensive to some because it seems to favor one outcome over the other. When it persists, we continue to have a problem, and that problem then requires intervention, rather than that these are 2 equal developmental pathways, and different things can benefit people depending on what pathway they develop. So I think that it's really key in those situations how that question is framed, because another way of looking at this is that we really do need to know. The more we can know about for which children early medical intervention might be helpful, the better we can apply it, and the less we run the risk that we make an error or that we unnecessarily suppress puberty. The second example is in the area of mental health, and whether the mental health concerns that LGBT people have are inherent to being LGBT or a result of the social stigma and minority stress that they experience. As I said, the diagnosis was included in the DSM, and at that point, that reflected the view of some that homosexuality was inherently pathological. Now, once it was removed, it took at least 2 decades before it really was okay for an investigator to study mental health, to seriously study mental health among gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. And what did we find? We found considerable disproportionate rates of anxiety and depression. For example, a study in New York found that 44% of gay and bisexual and men and lesbian women had clinical levels of anxiety, and 31% had mood disorders. And for the transgender population in my own work, we found also high numbers. We actually found in the 40s for depression and about a third for anxiety. And it's not until now that we are actually able to then develop approaches to address this. So I think as a result of the fact that initially there was this controversy and the community was offended by it and felt that this stood in the way of LGBT rights, as a result, that was a taboo topic to study in research for many years to come, and now we're suffering the consequences of that. Now finally, treatments are becoming available, but they could have been there from the very beginning and probably more needed at that time when the level of stigma was greater. The third example is an example in terms of research with the transgender population. And there has been a real surge, particularly in public health research, driven by the HIV epidemic, showing that among subgroups of this population, particularly transgender women of color with a history of sex work, HIV prevalence is very high. A meta-analysis showed that it's 12% based on self-report, 28% based on studies that actually tested people for HIV. And then within these studies with transgender women, African-American transgender women had an even higher prevalence of 56%. So these are alarming rates. However, when I conducted a national study of the transgender population more generally, we found that actually 2.2%, still higher than the general population, but 2.2%, considerably less than the numbers I just quoted, was HIV positive. And that was based on self-report. So in this case, we are getting a picture of the transgender community through this search in research and publications. But what we need to keep in mind is that we're focusing on a very specific group, and that does not necessarily reflect the situation in the larger transgender community. And people from within the community have felt that these publications, and over again documenting this high prevalence and the other hardship that comes with that, that really stigmatizes the population, because now when one comes out or says, I'm transgender, we immediately think, oh, you probably are in sex work, you have difficulty finding employment, and so on, because it presents an image of that population that is actually not generalizable. So I think in this case, it's really key to look at the question and the sampling method. And if the question is more of an epidemiological question, then there needs to be a more representative sample, whereas if the question is doing some formative research to improve the health of a particular segment that is particularly vulnerable, then that will be a different question and ask for a different sampling approach. And then the publications, I think, should really highlight that. So what can one do? What have we been working on in LGBT health research to address some of these issues? Well, first of all, I think we recognize the value of empirical research. And in the area of HIV, there has been plenty of it. But the other areas, as I acknowledged earlier, have been neglected. And knowledge is power, I think. At the same time, though, there needs to be an awareness of the implications of research questions and their answers. And there probably is a time and place to ask and pursue answers to certain questions and not others. And maybe the mental health example that I gave is a good example of that. Then I think to frame the question, so for example, on gender nonconformity, if we really frame that research as we need to know this to help gender nonconforming children better, then I think people will be a lot more amenable to it than some in the community that now feel that any research with these children is harmful, because just by doing research with them and asking these questions, we're saying that there's something wrong with them. And I think lastly, which I think is very effective, is to follow a community participatory model of research where the community is involved in the development of the research questions, of the study, of the interpretation and dissemination of the findings, so that they understand and contribute to how it should be framed, and that they own part of the study or own the findings and recognize the value it can bring to promoting the health of their community. Then I'll close with the fact that the IOM report on LGBT health actually has a recommendation that the NIH should encourage grant applications to address explicitly the inclusion or exclusion of sexual and gender minorities in their samples. So in the same section where one is to justify and indicate how women and minorities are included and why, we recommended to the NIH, even though that recommendation has not yet been accepted, that every investigator that does research with human subjects and applies for funding of the NIH ask themselves the question, will we include LGBT people? How is this relevant? Do we need to include enough of them? Do we need to oversample them to answer questions? Or does it really not make sense, because if we include them, we have 2 or 3 of them and we can't really say anything about this population? And again, that of course depends on the question. For some questions it doesn't matter, whether people are heterosexual or homosexual, but for other studies it can actually be very, very important, and neglecting the inclusion of that population then results in a gap, a continuing gap in terms of the knowledge that we need to inform care and answer other questions. Thank you very much.
I know. I don't even have to do anything to have that start off with a laugh. That's great. So I will be speaking. This button right here. The big one. The big button. There we go. About race and genetics. And I think one point to just begin with here is that this is, we've just heard a talk about research on specific populations, or with, ideally, specific populations, and how that can be an issue. Here I want to talk a little bit about a whole field that can pose special risks because of the nature of the field. So what are those? Some of these, most of these maybe will be familiar to you, but genetics has implications for other people. We know about the Lax family, we know about Havasupai. So we have the possibility not only for genetic relatives to be affected, but also for community members to be affected by research that they may not have any idea is even happening, that they certainly don't have a chance to weigh in on generally. Genetics also is not amenable to change in the way that many other health-related things are. Your genetics, you're kind of stuck with them. Susceptibility and risk information, these are usually predictive results and probabilistic results. So we have a phenomenon that can happen of causing or creating patients in waiting, right? So people who are sort of preemptively diagnosed with a condition that may or may not materialize. The uniqueness of the human genome means that these data, in combination with other identifiable data, makes a person identifiable. So if you have my genome and you know that it comes from a woman who is 4'11", and you saw this little thing over here with the moving the step over, I'm identifiable. Often genetics is conflated with race in ways that I'm going to suggest are problematic. And we have a tendency in our society to think of genetics as a special category of information that is something that is our essential identity. Even in everyday talk, we say, well, it must be in my genes. So I want to talk as an example, just real briefly, about race, genetics, and intelligence. I'm going to suggest that these are both highly problematic concepts and constructs. You'll hear more about this, I think, in another 12 minutes or so. But race is a hugely problematic thing to set out as a biological reality. Intelligence is not actually a lot less complicated than that. There are now theorized to be multiple intelligences that are context dependent, and competing measures perform differently across cultures. So this suggestion, as I'll talk about in a moment, that there are single measures that can give you, here's how smart a person is, are actually quite problematic across different groups of people. And intelligence is theorized now to be a pretty multifactorial process. And the things that I'm saying here, I'm going to talk a little bit just about race and genetics, but this is sort of the deal with genetics, right? Genetics is a piece of a much larger picture. Humans are complicated organisms. Yet we do seek genetic explanations for intelligence. So we had the Bell curve in 1994. That was a more wide-reaching study than merely genetics, but it did posit that intelligence is heritable, and that accounts for social inequality, and particularly the difficulties that face marginalized African American populations in the United States. More recently, in 2005, Bruce Lawn did some research that suggested that evolutionary pressures have resulted in larger brain sizes in people in Asia, Europe, and the Americas, and that those similar evolutionary patterns have not happened in Africa. That work has been contested by other genetic researchers who have been able to come up with alternative explanations for the data that have nothing to do with evolutionary pressure. Stephen Hsu, this is actually very, very current. He is kind of making his tour of the research that he's doing, and he is working with a sequencing outfit in China, sequencing very intelligent people to look for the genetic architecture, that's his phrase, of why they're so darn smart. So the idea that genetics can explain intelligence, which is a very complicated, complex of factors, is underlying all of these studies. More broadly speaking, the phenomena under study in genetic research are often poorly defined. What we see when we look at most of the genetic work that is out there and the kinds of genetic work that we're doing now, we're looking for association. As everybody in this room, I'm sure, knows, association doesn't explain why things happen. So that means that in a lot of genetic research, we actually aren't yet to the point of understanding biological mechanisms, and we aren't necessarily at the point of being able to claim evolutionary or adaptive pressures. When we focus real narrowly on genetics, there are some important things that get left out. We don't look at gene-environment interactions, we don't look at social determinants of health, and we don't really consider potential social consequences of focusing these questions in a narrow way. This is actually related to the point that Dr. Gawande made this morning about ineptitude, right? We have more knowledge, but what do we think it means, and how will we use it? A strong emphasis on genetic explanations, again, downplays social determinants. It can also reify differences among people and groups. Actually, just this morning, I was in a cab, and I was talking with the cabbie, and he said, "What are you doing?" And I was explaining what I was doing. And the thing that I usually try to say when I'm talking with lay people about genetics is we are 99.9% the same. That's true. It's not the underlying assumption of a lot of the research that we're doing is looking for differences, and it's also looking for deficits, reifying differences, and often the groups that are most interesting, in quotes, to study are groups that have been isolated and have historically been marginalized. Genetics also gives us the potential of defining affected groups as inherently flawed, that if a person has a genetic problem, then they just are that way, which means that socially, maybe we don't feel like we have to do anything about it. It's not anybody's fault, they just have this problem, right? So much larger social consequences. And the other big social issue that I think comes up in an overly narrow focus on genetic information and genetic causality is that it distracts attention from proven interventions. So if what you care about is intelligence in racial minority communities, you might also want to know about poverty. You might want to know about school attendance. You might want to know about executive functioning and other kinds of psychological constructs that affect how well a child is able to apply himself or herself in school, rather than saying, well, genetically, this is how smart this person is. I don't want to belabor this, but I do think that in a larger social sense, paying attention to the history of similar kinds of research is an obligation that all of us have, whether we're doing research or we are reviewing research. And the eugenic movement was not actually all that long ago. And there are some tendencies that we're seeing now, I think some social currents that might, if we paid attention, sound a little bit familiar. So tendencies toward pushing efficiency, being scientific in our management and our choices at a social level. That's, on the one hand, very positive development. On the other hand, it means that there are some things we should probably be watching and paying attention to ourselves as we head down that road. The social consequences of genetic knowledge historically have included discrimination, immigration restriction, forced sterilization, and euthanization. Now, I'm not saying I think that's where we're headed, but it's happened before, which means that we have a responsibility, and none of those guys thought they were doing anything bad, right? I teach some ethics classes to medical students, and the thing that I hear every single time we start the quarter is, I don't understand why I have to be here, I'm not a Nazi. We all have an obligation to contest that way of thinking about ethics. It's not that we have bad people doing bad things. It's that we have good people who are so locked into their way of thinking about a problem that they lose track of what they're doing. So what can IRBs do? As I've just said, consider the history of similar research. In genetic studies, where we're looking at associations a lot of the time, it's worth asking about planned subgroup analyses, right? So it may be that someone is doing a study on intelligence and genetics. You may wish to know what subcategories they plan to look at and how they plan to publish those results. Requiring community representation, and that can be in the form of a community advisory board, that can be a group that reviews publications before they go in, or it can be a group that is sort of more ad hoc, that works with you over time, is an important piece for researchers, and I also think for IRBs. Seeking appropriate consultation and review, either from people who have done similar work, from people who have worked with the community that the researchers are planning to work with, is a relatively easy step and a good reality check if you feel that you may not exactly know what the situation on the ground will look like. Outreach efforts beyond sort of the static newsletter or website are also worth at least suggesting to researchers. We heard earlier about the interest, the growing interest that the communities in the United States have, many communities now have, in understanding what research is being done and how it will affect them. And in a way, this is, I think, a case of be careful what you wish for, right? Researchers have been saying for a long time, if only they cared about our work. Well, now they do, and it's produced a whole new set of things that we need to consider. And I don't think we are quite caught up on that yet. And it's an especially fast-moving target in the area of genetics, partly because genetics is complicated. A lot of people, I mean, the genetics education I received in high school, not so great. I certainly had not extracted DNA by the time I was in the 8th grade, which is what's happening now, right? So we really have some work to do in education and outreach, just generically in the United States. And then, as Walter mentioned, community-based participatory research approaches, which really invite community members in at a much earlier stage in the process and in a much more substantive way. in my own work and in the work of other people who are interested in these ideas, we're trying to move away from the words human subjects. When you say to a person who is a human subject, that's what you are, they don't like it. They want to be participants. They want to have a voice. They want to really understand what's happening. They don't want to be somebody we do things to. So all of those are things that I think IRBs can take, we have more or less power over some of these things, but I think we can foster a culture where more involvement and more open discussion of what is the research we should pursue and why is a worthwhile step. There are some references that will be on the online tool, and thanks for your attention.
And the big one, David? The big one? Yes. No, there it is. Thank you all. And David Strauss, kind of like my boss, thank you for inviting me to participate in this distinguished panel. Since the earlier speakers ended earlier, I will take their time, so I'll be speaking to you all for the next hour. This is actually a little different for me. I'm actually now promoting a book, and so I've been dealing a lot with the forest. Now, today, I'm asked to talk about the trees, some details about the kind of work that I do, and some of these issues that I think about as an IRB member. And I'm going to present an issue related to my research, the types of research that I do. I'll talk about that in a second. And I guess I'm here to maybe seek advice as well as maybe transmit some information. So hopefully we can have a lively discussion after this. So the type of work that I do is I bring people into the laboratory, and we actually administer drugs of abuse like crack cocaine, methamphetamine, marijuana. So we bring these people into the lab with the purposes of trying to understand or trying to help folks who may be experiencing drug abuse problems. We try and help them by developing certain types of medications that will help them stop using the drug or stop abusing the drug. This is just one study in which one of the types of studies that we do, we study the effects of some potential treatment medication, in this case, modafinil or Provigil, on cocaine, crack cocaine, self-administration. So people are presented with an opportunity to take various doses of crack cocaine in the lab under conditions where they have a potential treatment medication on board or a placebo, various doses of the potential treatment medication. If you focus your attention on the left-hand side of the graph, that's a measure of drug taking. Right here, we see that under active drug condition, under the modafinil condition, cocaine self-administration is significantly decreased. Cocaine self-administration in the laboratory is a difficult behavior to disrupt. So I've been doing this work now for about 15 years, and this is the only study that I've used a medication that's actually decreased cocaine self-administration in the lab. So these are the best data that I'm showing you. These are not representative data. These are the best data. You know how people say, I'm showing you representative data? No, I'm showing you the best data, okay? All right. We also do other types of experiments where we bring people into the lab and we see if we can disrupt cocaine taking behavior by providing things like alternative reinforcers. So giving people options, would that stop people's choice of taking cocaine? So there's this belief in the popular culture that cocaine taking behavior, it's so difficult to disrupt. Once you give a cocaine addict or a cocaine-dependent person a hit of cocaine, you cannot disrupt the behavior. But what we've shown is that, yeah, you can if you provide appropriate alternatives. In this case, we provided $5 as an alternative. you can shift the behavior to the choice from cocaine taking to maybe 50% of the occasion and 50% of the money. But if you offer something like $20, you can completely abolish cocaine self-administration in the laboratory. Now, this finding has made a big splash recently. It was recently highlighted in the New York Times because it was just inconsistent with the popular sort of notion of crack cocaine taking behavior. People thought that cocaine addicts were just driven to get another hit of the drug. And so it's made a big splash recently. Now, all of that to say that the work that we're doing, we think, is quite important. We are changing people's perspectives about the crack cocaine users. We're trying to get rid of some of those stereotypes that we may have about this drug. But there's a problem in terms of the type of research that we do, particularly as I think about it as an IRB member. When we look at the participants in our studies, they are overwhelmingly Black. About 80% of the participants in our studies are Black, whereas 6% are Hispanic, 14% are white. Now, how does this compare to the general crack cocaine taking population? Well, the general data suggests that there are more white cocaine users than crack cocaine users than Black cocaine users. I know some people that find that surprising, but these data we have known for some time. The majority of folks who use crack cocaine, well, the typical crack cocaine user looks like this guy. This, of course, is Mayor Rob Ford. Mr. Ford has recently admitted to using crack cocaine and has really provided a lot of comedic material for the late night comics. But this is the typical crack cocaine user, white male who is employed, who is handling his responsibilities, despite what you might think of this guy, but this is the typical user. But still, I am faced with a dilemma in the type of research I do. I'm faced with a dilemma when I think about the ethical principles that guide what we do as researchers. There's respect for person, benevolence, and justice. And so the one that I worry about deals with justice. Justice says that the benefits and the risks must be fairly distributed across individuals and groups, such that no specific group is being exploited. My main concern with the type of work that we do is that we may one group, Black folks, are being subjected to most of the risk in this type of research. So it raises the question, what are the risks? And, well, rather than tell you, I'll let this guy tell you. Oh, sorry, my bad. There we go.
This is crack, rock cocaine. It isn't glamorous or cool or kid stuff. It's the most addictive kind of cocaine, and it can kill you. What's really bad is nobody knows how much it takes. So every time you use it, you risk dying. It isn't worth it. Look, everybody wants to be cool, but doing it with crack isn't just wrong. It could be dead wrong.
Those aren't exactly the risks, but that's okay. We'll talk about that in a second. But one of the things I want to say is that those perceived risks played an important role in this country in terms of how we regulate crack cocaine versus other forms of cocaine. In 1986, 1988, what we did was to pass legislation that punished crack cocaine 100 times more harshly than that of powder cocaine, in part because of the perceived risk that that brilliant scholar Pee Wee Herman just delineated for us. Because of those perceived risks, we punish the drug more harshly. And whenever you have legislation like we had with crack cocaine and the hysteria surrounding crack cocaine, you have consequences to that. What happened? Oh, did I do something? What happened to our... No, I disconnected it. Sorry about that, guys. All of this technology, my bad. It's connected now. Back online. Okay, so whenever you have that type of legislation, you have consequences. And the consequences to that type of legislation...
Put it back in show mode.
Thank you. Now, I present quite a bit, so I'm having all this trouble. I'm pretending that this is awkward and I'm new at this. So whenever you have those type of legislation and the hysteria, there's always consequences. And the bottom line here is that 80%, more than 80% of the people convicted under those new laws were black crack cocaine users, when we know that most of the users were not black. And so the laws were enforced in a racially discriminatory manner, in part because of our beliefs in those perceived risks. I'm going to talk about the real risks in a second, but I just want to make sure we have this backdrop. So when we think about the people who have been affected or arrested by these laws, it's been black people for the most part. Now, let's talk about the real risk. When we think about crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, focus your attention on the left side of the graph. That's powder cocaine. On your right side of the graph, that is crack cocaine. The only difference is this hydrochloride group on the powder cocaine. The hydrochloride group does not contribute to the biology or the pharmacology of cocaine, so it has no biological activity. The only thing that's important here for the hydrochloride portion is that you can't smoke the powder cocaine because of the hydrochloride portion. The temperatures that are required to heat the hydrochloride portion is so high, the base, the rest of the cocaine, decomposes. So you can't smoke it. Now, if you want to smoke it, you have to remove the hydrochloride portion, freeing the base, free base, and that's what you have with crack cocaine. But it produces the same effect if you intravenously shoot powder cocaine. That effect and crack cocaine are exactly the same effect. So the drug effects are the same. And what are those effects? These effects are predictable. As I said, we have been doing this work along with other people around the country have been doing this work. Effects are predictable, increase the dose, increasing effects. Heart rate, increase blood pressure, increase euphoria, some sleep disruption, but not much because the effects of cocaine are short-lived, not like the amphetamines where they're longer. Food intake, you can decrease the food intake, but not long. As we saw, Mayor Ford, he's a pretty heavy guy. So food intake is really not disrupted that much, contrary to the popular beliefs. Crack cocaine's effects are predictable. You may have heard people say that the effects are unpredictable. As Pee Wee Herman has said, it's just simply not true. Okay, so what's the real sort of risk that participants may be experiencing in the types of studies that I do? My major concern with the risk not being evenly distributed are mainly related to the interactive effects of the medications that we're testing to possibly treat cocaine abuse, or the effects produced by those other medications. I'm more concerned about those effects. Other sort of risks that I worry about is in terms of the research that we do and the large numbers of black people that we have in these studies, I worry about us reinforcing those stereotypes about the users. Many of our users in our studies are poor black folks. That's the bottom line for the most part. And in part, they are doing some of these studies because they have limited other occupational opportunities. So when we have studies like ours that have these large numbers of black folks, it may inadvertently provide some justification for the disproportionate numbers of black people who are being arrested under the crack cocaine law. So I worry about that, and I worry about this further stigmatizing of this population. Now, I am not saying that researchers like me and others who do the kind of work I do are racist or anything like that. I'm not saying that at all. It's more likely when they don't address the issues that I'm raising with you all today that they are willfully ignorant. It's not in their real interest to address these issues, and they're simply apathetic. And so I come today to maybe think about what we can do as IRB members or IRBs around the country. Maybe we should ask researchers to acknowledge an understanding of the principle of justice. Maybe we can require them to demonstrate sound justifications for having these large numbers of black participants in their studies. For example, if you're in Detroit, which is primarily black, I think it's still primarily black, like I know DC recently went white, right? So things are changing, but I think Detroit is still primarily black. We would understand the large numbers of black participants in studies in Detroit. But in Maine, maybe not so much, right? So also, maybe we should require researchers to address the risk of stigma and those sort of issues when they submit their protocols in their publications. If we don't do that, I'd like to just end with the words of Barbara Jordan. She was the first congressperson, first black female congressperson elected to sit to the Senate, to the House in the South. And Barbara Jordan said that if society today allows wrongs to go unchallenged, the impression is created that these wrongs have the approval of the majority. And with that, I think we should have a good conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. We'd like to take some questions if people have them, but let me actually start with the first question, if I might. So I began with a story of a true event that occurred that I think touches on each of the kinds of points that you raised in your individual presentations. Researchers interested in connecting behavior to biology sampled the population that is already burdened excessively both by crime and by the connection between crime and the communities that they come from. What should we have done differently in a study where we're seeking the connection between biology and aggressive behavior in children?
Oh. Well, we both can do this. You did such a great presentation. So one of the things, as I think about the connection between biology and behavior, one of the things that has been troubling me over the past several years is that biology has taken priority. The behavior is kind of an afterthought, such that
it's not even described that well. And it's not even, it's a small component of a complicated behavior, but it's described as if it's the major outcome measure. So one of the things that I would just encourage people to do is to make sure that the investigators have an appropriate characterization of the behavior first. If they do not, and they say we are only measuring or interested in this small component of the behavior, just make sure that that is prominent in their description of the study.
Yeah, I would just mainly echo that and say, in the example that I talked about, you know, positing that intelligence can be understood as a genetic phenomenon, given all that we know and understand about intelligence and all that we don't know but suspect, just from walking around as a human being, you can tell, we know this in our gut, that it's not strictly a matter of genetics. Even if you look at a particular family and you say, that's a smart family, that means they have the money to go to school, probably. It means that everybody can get enough sleep at night. It means that there is social support for going to school every day. So there are a lot of, you can afford books, right? I mean, there are a lot of other factors, and I think the risk comes in when we look for a single explanation. And again, I'm going to harken back to the keynote this morning. The phenomena that we are interested in understanding now are not, in genetics, single gene disorders, right? They are these much more complex, multifactorial phenomena, and I think, and that's true biologically, it's also maybe even more true when you look at behavioral issues.
But if I could just understand that, and then Walter. So the first mistake that was made was by overly simplifying this notion of aggression and then looking at a prison population to identify those who are aggressive, and then making the overly simplistic connection and not avoiding the unwanted association between aggression and this community of color. And then I'll just add one thing that came from your talks, all of your talks, is that we failed to engage the community prior to developing the study. Had we done so, we would have been less ignorant and less inept, to borrow the phrase, than I think it turned out we were. Walter?
Yeah, I just want to say that it's not uncommon in transgender health research that we use this particular population, special population, to answer questions about gender and identity development that just has a heightened, this population has a heightened awareness of it. And it's as you were looking at that issue under a microscope. So I think that, yes, you can look at a particular population. Maybe you wanted, a certain level of aggression, then you go to the prison population and so forth. But I think, again, as you said, you want to involve the community and say, do we want to help? Or what is our role? Do we have a role to play? Or what role do we have to play in answering this particular question? And how is that going to be beneficial for us and for the larger society of which we are a part?
The question from the audience?
We can hear you, then we'll repeat the question.
Okay. Hi. Michelle Russell-Einhorn, Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. So first of all, thank you for a very thought-provoking and informative presentation on all of your parts. It really was very eye-opening, at least to me. So Dr. Hart, I would be interested in hearing a little about the types of recruitment procedures you used in terms of getting people into your crack cocaine studies, and I'd be interested in hearing about some of the things that would exclude people from participating. Thank you.
Yeah, this is an area that we can actually do better, the question about recruitment. Basically, we do online flyers, the free newspapers in New York, like the Village Voice, and word of mouth. That's the main sort of recruitment strategy that we use. Now, the question about what would exclude someone from doing our studies. So as I pointed out, we have given thousands of doses of crack cocaine without incident. in part because of the careful sort of screening procedures. So we usually take people who are 21 years to 50 years, and they have to be healthy, pass physical examinations, so I think if people are not healthy, they have any sort of illnesses, they wouldn't make it into the study. And they all have to have used crack cocaine before. Many of the studies look at people who they have to use more crack cocaine than that's going to be administered in the study.
Do you have a sense of why you are getting more people who are black in your studies than people who are white crack cocaine users? And
I do. I've thought about this a lot. There are multiple reasons. In part, crack cocaine is so vilified in the United States. The people who do our studies are, I think, more desperate, and so they're willing to be identified as crack cocaine users. Many white folks have other options, other employment opportunities before reaching that point, so we don't see them. I think that's going on. So some of these things are beyond the control of the investigators. It's in New York City, for example, there are times where the unemployment rate among black men is something like 50%. When you have that situation, it's not good.
thank you, and keep up your good work.
Thank you.
Thanks. We have a question over here.
Hi, Catherine McDougall, Bay State Medical Center. My question is around the genetic research. And forgive me, it might take me a little while to get around to it. It comes within the context of GINA and what federal protections do exist around genetic research and the results thereof, and what don't exist at the federal level but maybe exist at the state level, and how clear we make it to our research participants about the risks related to their future when they participate in genetic research, whether or not they'll be eligible to receive long-term care benefits, whether or not their health care premiums are going to go up. And then in addition to that, what are your thoughts on how we are contributing to driving up the cost of health care and driving down accessibility to health care when we do these types of studies, even though that's not our intention?
Well, that is not a tiny little question, is it? So let me start with the easy part, which is GINA, for anybody who doesn't know, is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. It is a law in the United States that prohibits the use of genetic information to discriminate against people for employment or for health insurance. So it leaves out long-term care insurance, leaves out life insurance. In the consent forms, I also sit on the IRB, and we do require, if a consent form says there's this nifty law called GINA that will protect you, we do require that they explain what exactly it protects and what it doesn't protect. And that's largely an untested law still at this point. And proving discrimination is extremely difficult under the best of circumstances. Proving discrimination in the kinds of contexts we're talking about with genetics, I'm in Massachusetts, I'm going to say it's wicked difficult, wicked hard. So the second question, I think, what happens in terms of cost with genetics? I'm not totally sure I understand what you're asking, but I think one of the things, as genetic information becomes more available and more prevalent, I think one of the things that we're going to circle back to this law, right? We have underwriting procedures in the United States where anybody who's going to insure you can review your entire medical history. Right now, I would say this is a case where we probably do have an unreasonable genetic exceptionalism about you can't know if I'm a CF carrier, but you can know if I have a CF diagnosis, right? Because it's in the record. You can see all of that. This is not, it'll be interesting to see what happens with GINA as genetics becomes a more regular part of care. Does it contribute to costs? Absolutely. Will sequencing, if that's the direction that things really are going, that we sequence everybody and their brother, baby, when they're born, will that be more expensive? Absolutely it will. Will it contribute to better care? I would say that in a lot of ways the jury's out on that. Cancer genetics, which was a topic of one of the keynotes this morning, is really an exception at this juncture.
Want to take one from the middle?
Hi, Stephanie Solomon, St. Louis University. I guess I'm curious more about, a lot of people have been talking and worrying about social harms of research for quite a while now, and I feel like when you're in the world of, research performance and research regulation, I sit there both on an IRB and as a researcher, and I see that no one is really responsible for taking care of it. Researchers, we can say things like, it'd be great if you did community engagement, but some of them do it and some of them don't. And if you ask them to worry about social harms, they'll be like, that's, what the IRB is there for. And then you get to the IRB and they're specifically instructed not to look at policy implications and social harms, at least at a certain level. And that ambiguity of that requirement is interesting too. And so I guess I'm kind of saying, like, if we want to actually implement this and worry about this like most of us do, like, is there any place that the buck actually stops? I also teach researchers, so I try to kind of pound it into their head that they should worry about this, but it's not built into their education, and it's not something IRBs are required or sometimes prohibited to do. And I guess I'm just wondering how. How is my question?
No, I think that's...
You look so petrified.
I think that when it comes to the LGBT health research, the community, we as researchers are under tremendous scrutiny. They won't let us get away with anything. They hold us accountable. But it may be very different in other areas.
I do, just because this is all IRB people, I do want to say, the regs are a floor. And I think all of us, we're in a position where we think about these broader social issues, and I think it's an obligation that we raise a little hell if that's appropriate. I have been in the uncomfortable position of being on an IRB and being told that's beyond the scope of what the regs require. IRBs are not limited to the language of the regulations. I would say that. There are other reasons, institutional reasons, political reasons, that you may or may not want to stick your neck out, but I think that if IRBs sit on their hands and rely solely, I said earlier, I teach ethics classes to people, RCR classes to bench scientists. They don't want to be there. They don't feel like any of this is relevant to them. And so any place where I think any of us have an opportunity to do something helpful, I think that's an obligation.
I think we could have a whole discussion on that question. And we have a number of people in line. I don't want to get into it too much, but there's also the issue of grant funding and all the rest of these kinds of things. You want to make sure people make progress on their grants, and that's a complicated issue, and it wouldn't do you any justice to give you a superficial answer. I'm happy to
Maybe your next book.
Yeah, we could talk about that after this.
I just want to say, I think that's a great question, is who ultimately is responsible. And my somewhat, ironic or sarcastic answer is to say, one set of congressional hearings on a study that you've been involved with is enough to disabuse most institutions of worrying about who's responsible. Everybody becomes sensitized to those kinds of issues of social harms and stigma and allegations of racism. And I think, to borrow the phrase from this morning again, it's really critical that you keep the conversation going. We spend a lot of time at the IRB, looking at grant applications and protocol summary forms that, detail the racial and ethnic and gender breakdown. And we often don't know what to do with this information. We don't know whether it's good or bad to be more inclusive. We don't know if it's adequate for the study population to be reflective of the population of people in the specific community with the disorder. As I said in the study that I quoted earlier, we recruited a population that reflected the demographics of the prison population. It didn't do us any good. It was a kind of inept approach to the question. But I think IRB should be struggling with these questions of justice, and it is well within our purview to be thinking about those things in an intelligent way. And I think sometimes institutions need to set policy. Sometimes at our institution, in a sense, risk management played a heavy hand in forcing the institution to get more active around involving the community in research activities. So I would say that everybody needs to be sensitized to these issues. I think we're to that side now.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up actually on that with a radical suggestion. I'm Bill Freeman, Northwest Indian College. It's a tribal college IRB. And most, if not all, tribal college IRBs and Indian Health Board IRBs go a step further because they say the biggest harm that has occurred to communities is at the point of publication. And in fact, all the examples that have been given this afternoon, are at the point of publication. Therefore, to minimize harms, we review the draft research, articles and presentations in terms of minimizing harms, in terms of how is it framed. We're not talking about changing the data. That's not the issue. It's around how is it framed, has a community been involved, and do they see that there are harms the IRB doesn't? So my radical suggestion is IRB should be starting to review publications before they are published.
I would say that would bring out the First Amendment police at most academic institutions. And although it's probably effective, I would say that most of us recognize that it'd be better to intervene earlier in the process rather than at the time of publication when I would say the harm might already be, if not done, nearly done. Walter?
And there's peer review that should take some of that on, I think, in terms of publication.
Let me just go back to that, because I think it's really important. I think that this is bread and butter IRB stuff. I think to answer the question of justice, people should be asking questions like, why is this study recruiting only African Americans? How is that relevant to the hypothesis being studied? Why is this population being subjected to risks of the study? Is this population the inevitable population? Is there a reason that the investor can't create a more diverse population, maybe answer questions relevant to the different groups? But that, to me, is sort of central to this notion of how subjects are selected for research studies. And I think that we don't know how to do it well. And ironically, although we get this excruciating detail about the number of subjects collected each year, and by race and gender and so on, we never ask, at least as a matter of routine, what their socio-demographic status is. So we don't know whether we're getting poor folks or not. And that's a suggestion for another time. Yes?
My name is Gita Azari. I'm from Brown University. So I have a question about race. Since race is a colonialist constructed label, and it may not have any purpose now in this day and age, how is the research community supposed to deal with race as a label and identity when so many funding sources and sponsors, I think even the NIH, asks researchers to discuss their recruitment in terms of race and labeling and defining how many people of different races are going to be recruiting?
I think if you look around this room, you will see that race is still important in this country. If you go to our prisons, it's still important because black men, for example, make up 6% of the general population, 35% of the prison population. Race is still important. It's a social construct, of course, but it carries huge consequences in this society.
As a quick follow-up, so if we're so focused on race, is it something that we need to continue to research race as an identity, or is it something we should be trying to slightly change into discussing ethnicity as opposed to the idea of race?
Race is the most conspicuous sort of characteristic. And when we think about moving away from race to ethnicity, you certainly can do that. But we'd be naive to think that race itself is not an important characteristic. I mean, look in this room. There are no black men. There's a reason for that. Yeah, I know. Everybody's pointing to the one brother there. I know. The point is that, one of the things that really disturbs me, and I'm less proud of our country about, and I served in our military, I did all that sort of thing, is our inability to talk honestly about the importance of the social construct of race, what it means. And so I am reluctant when we start to talk about other things like class, ethnicity, in order to avoid race. Like the French, they don't talk about race, but if you go to their prisons, only people who are there are black and brown people. But they don't call it race. And so I'm worried that we're trying to move to a similar model.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Andy Bertolatis. I'm an IRB chair at the University of Iowa, and it popped into my head while I was listening to your excellent and provocative presentations that we have actually reviewed at least 2 studies in the last year or so that are actually proposing to study what I might think of as the neurobiology of racism, where people are actually asked to look at, and there's an element of deception here, they're not really told up front what the study's about. They're shown pictures of differently appearing people while there's neuroimaging and maybe some other kinds of testing going on. And I just wonder what the panelists might have to say about that. Is that like going too far in the 180-degree direction from what we're concerned about in this area? Thanks.
You guys should take it. I mean, I have a lot to say about it.
I'll just say this is slightly different than in the area of stigma attached to gender nonconformity and homophobia. I think there's not enough research really on the stigma itself and what is so challenging for people and what are they up against when they interact with that population. But for race, it might be different, and then the neurobiology part is kind of your area.
Yeah, I am not convinced that I have anything really intelligent to say about that question. So I think I won't.
So in terms of the neurobiology, I published a paper in 2012 in neuropsychopharmacology looking at neurobiology of cognitive impairments or cognitive functioning in methamphetamine users. And I painstakingly go through the literature to point out my concerns with using something like MRI and those techniques to understand these complicated human behaviors. Hart et al., 2012, it would apply here.
Yeah, you know, as everybody says, good ethics begins with good science. And I don't know enough about the projects to be critical of them, but I think much of the trouble that we find ourselves in, and many of the kinds of stories that we've told today, have to do with scientific questions which are murky, and then they lend themselves to all kinds of criticisms, and they give rise to results which are troubling.
Yeah, I'm Hannah Puchner. I'm IRB chair, New York University, Abu Dhabi. And I want to sort of talk about the sort of one really basic tenet in the presentation by Susan and Carl was that race is a social construct, which I agree with. But I know some research done by my colleague Anne Morning at NYU who has shown that in biology textbooks that are used in colleges across the country and among teachers who teach about race in colleges and among students, it's not a minority of people in the United States today who believe that race has a biological reality. And my suspicion based on sort of that work is that, you know, this sort of split between people who believe in race as a biological reality and those who don't goes right through our investigators and through our IRBs. So first of all, we don't have these discussions regularly in IRBs, but you know, I think this plays a role in many ways. Second, I think as a researcher, I can sort of devote time to trying to debunk these notions in various ways. But as an IRB chair, I've I feel myself stopping short of requiring the investigators to do the same thing, if that is not sort of their main focus. But they do include, say, minorities, for the justice of documenting inequalities in health burdens or other burdens. They do include minorities, and they will document some differences, and we all don't know what it means. But it shouldn't be forbidden, right? We can't, or at least I feel that is not the right way to go. But to require them to say, if you document a difference, then you have to do, some sort of a campaign about what the difference means. That is a big, I think it's a big burden that we would have to put on all sorts of investigators, many of which might not be equipped to actually carry that burden in a good way.
I'm afraid that we need to stop now. But let me answer.
It was
this.
that question.
Let me no. Let's respond to that question, and then let me ask anyone who has other questions to come up and speak with us afterwards. So why don't we address that question, and then we'll have to wind up.
I'll just say quickly, in terms of the IOM committee recommending that LGBT is one of those things that researchers address, it's exactly for that purpose, to have them ask these questions and consider this, and if they need to consult with others.
Yeah, and I think I would just echo that. We are, I think, at an inflection point in genetic research, which is really the field that I'm most familiar with right now. There is this funny sort of slippage. You can have a conversation with someone and they can say, yeah, I get it, race isn't real. And then you look at their data and every sub-analysis is by racial category. And without a whole lot of reflection about why and what might that mean and what might it not mean, right? I think all of these reportings by race are associations that are partial and that may not be explanatory in the way that they are, they look like they're explanatory and they may not be. So I think for all of this, a call to greater humility and transparency about what we know and what we don't is helpful. And insofar as we're able to foster that, I think that's a service to everybody.
I want to thank Walter, Susan, and Carl for their presentations today, and thank all of you. Carl is actually doing a book signing outside now, and the rest of us will be up here if you have any questions. But thank you for your attention. That was the. Yeah.